Oh, right. So my name is Emily Bennett. I'm one of the career consultants here at the University of Pittsburgh's Career Center. I'm going to make sure to send out these slides afterwards so that you have them. And then throughout the presentation, feel free to interrupt me if you have questions. You can take yourself off of mute, or you can just put something in the chat. So you should be seeing my slides right now. So just to get started here in terms of where are we at? We're obviously still in the midst of a pandemic. So some of the resources and the stats that I'm going to supply are obviously subject to change as things sort of pan out. But the information that's provided should help provide you a little bit of context for some things that might be happening in the workforce that you have to think about in terms of, where are we headed with certain industries? What's the work environment going to look like, and so on. So just starting in terms of thinking about, what are some of the things people are thinking? I'm sure everyone has got sort of their own, prediction of the future here. But in many ways, it started off with, people saying, oh, these trying times, I can't wait for things to get back to normal, and this is just temporary. And then as things continued to go on, it turned into, well, what's our new normal going to look like? It was more futuristic. It's like, some of us don't want to go backwards, now that they have seen the way things could be, or, potentially people who weren't sure about remote work when forced to do it. Now they're like, I can't go back to the office. And different groups of people have different experiences towards this. Could be based on your socioeconomic factors, ethnicity, and so on. And so our eyes have been opened, so it is kind of hard in some ways to go backwards. And then in terms of potentially being an opportunity to do better, there are definitely companies that are taking this as an opportunity to change the way that they do business, change the way that they recruit and onboard and develop their talent. So you will see that, you'll see that as a theme. And then lastly, though, you do want to think to yourself, what do I want my future to look like? Is there something that I want to change as a result of what I experienced, over this past time here? Okay, so, and then in terms of trends, okay, so, things that have come up, biggest one by far is just the fact that different industries were impacted in different ways during this pandemic. And for anyone that has a friend or is currently working in, food service or retail, how, this went, there was closures and openings and not necessarily knowing how many staff to had. I mean, it really screwed up the industry. But then whenever you take a look at industries as a whole, I want to challenge you in order and to not lump them all in together. So for instance, retail, sure, the small businesses definitely took a hit, but when you start to think about the Amazons and the Lowe's and the Home Depots of the world, they did very well and continue to do very well during this pandemic. So when you start to hear things about industry trends and potentially areas that you might be interested in, I still want to challenge you to think in terms of the actual company and potentially even the region, that the company is located in. And then just looking at this industry trend chart, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, this is their job. They track labor, they track growth and opportunities and things like that. And so what they were doing is looking in terms of, is there going to be a moderate impact to the world of work and to industries, meaning, sure, some things have changed, but maybe not everything. Whereas they also want to have a strong impact stance to showcase what if companies don't want to go back to the way that it was. What happened with automation and remote work during this time period. So as you can see, between the moderate and the strong for some industries, there is a lot of difference. And then there's some growth too that happened. So, as I mentioned, Amazon was doing fine. A lot of the tech firms were doing really well because their work easily translated to remote anyways. Some of them were already remote before the pandemic. We've also seen a growth in life sciences companies. So, you've got your clinical research, you've got your medical devices, pharmaceuticals, drug discovery companies. Because the pandemic is big business here, they're working on all sorts of things, vaccines, rapid tests, and things like that. But it also has brought to the forefront the need for healthcare and services that are around it. So if you have an interest in these areas, you can delve even further into what does the setting actually look like? Are you in a healthcare setting in the healthcare industry, or are you in like maybe applied research and life sciences? So, why I'm telling you all this will become more clear as we move throughout this workshop, but there are really good resources that you could look into. So with each trend, there's some things I want you to keep in mind here. So recovery is going to look different for each industry, each company, and each region. You do want to be able to factor in automation to an extent. Okay, so certain industries, they had to go basically to automation because they couldn't safely have people in the workplace. Some it was temporary, some it's there to stay. But by far, remote work was the biggest indicator of a company environment, success, what they were able to pull off and what they weren't. And so whenever you start to look into different places, know that they all had different experiences, obviously managed by different teams that have, had varying different experiences. So whenever you're looking into places, I even if your industry that you had an interest in tanked, like maybe it's not the best idea right now, I want you to consider the fact that the Bureau of Labor Statistics also cites that the average person between 25 and 34 changes their position every 2.8 years. So if you feel like you have to take a different position within the same industry, or maybe the same type of role but in a different industry, don't feel like that's a failure in any way. You're just adapting to the industry and the market conditions. You could use that as an opportunity for another position as things start to get a little bit better. And a lot of the statisticians are thinking that it's going to be 5 years for some of these industries in order to recover. So I just want you to be aware of that. And then two, there's always things beyond our control. This is most likely not the last pandemic. I mean, I hope it is, but it's most likely not. And like other things are going to come up in your life, and there could be recessions and things like that. So the more that you sort of like grasp what's going on, in industry and out there, it's going to be beneficial throughout your career. And I hate to say this, but waiting and hoping isn't necessarily a strategy. So like before it could have been, let's say you're like, oh, I didn't, it would have been nice to have done the internship, but I didn't really need to. I was fine working on projects or just taking it easy. It's been a rough year. That's different than saying like, oh, I'm just going to keep waiting until something opens up in my field, or I'm going to keep waiting until the industry recovers. That's not necessarily a good idea if you don't really know when that's going to be, because if you could be picking up other skills at other companies or doing other things that could help your career overall, that will be beneficial in the long run here. So I just want you to not get too comfortable with like the whole waiting. Because some things are they're going to take some time, to come back. So strategies for success here, do your research. I mentioned the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but there's also business journals. There's a website called vault.com. Consulting firms like McKinsey and Deloitte, they're constantly producing reports about things. So if you do a Google search on things, you could even look up specific industries that have high growth, or ones that you already have an interest in. And I know that students don't necessarily think in terms of industries. Like they might think, oh, I just want to get a job. I don't necessarily care what industry it is. Do yourself a favor though, and try to narrow it down or look into certain ones. Because what ends up happening as you're applying online on these big job boards, LinkedIn, Indeed, Handshake, you're seeing the same jobs that everyone else is. So you're competing with a lot of people. You might not necessarily have had to if you had created more of like a targeted approach to your job search. And a way to do that is to start thinking in terms of industries. And sometimes knowing what you don't want to do can also be helpful, because it can give you clues to other industries that might be its total opposite. And so I really want you to think in terms of that. And in terms of looking into companies, there are some great resources out there. There's Handshake Employer Directory, which I know a lot of students don't necessarily see. It is located under the Jobs tab. Before you actually click through for the keyword search in the job search part, it says employers. It's like off to the right. You can build company lists in there. There's company contact info. There's a site called BuzzFile where it is a database that does organize companies by major. And I'm always telling students, don't get hung up on your major. It's more so like your interest and your skills. But if you really don't know where to start, BuzzFile will help you. And it is going to want you to refine your search results by location. So even if you are open into moving wherever, a national search, I'm still going to encourage you to think of maybe like 5 or 6 different places that you might like to work or live, and try to organize the search in that way. So like, get yourself a spreadsheet, maybe make tabs with the different geographic locations, keep track of some companies and the progress you're making. Did you apply? Did you hear back? Did you follow up? Handshake's employer directory has contact info for some of the employers. So, you can follow up with the applications that way. And for any of you that have LinkedIn, LinkedIn's great for company research because companies will tell you what they want you to know about them right on their LinkedIn. They'll have videos and stories and press releases and things. And then all of you as students have access to Pitt Commons, which is accessible through the Pitt portal. And this is the university's mentoring platform. So you could talk to people who are in various industries. You can do what's called an informational interview, just having a quick talk with them in terms of like, their jobs or the types of work that they're doing or the company. So I really encourage you to use your Pitt resources here. And neither Pitt Commons or Handshake goes away after graduation, just a heads up. So, you have time to delve into those. Okay, trend number 2, the work environment has changed. If you look at this survey that McKinsey did very recently, you can see that pre-COVID, about 62% of people were favoring being on site, being in a physical office space. 30% desired the hybrid model, whether they were in it or not, which mainly means that you either have the flexibility to work from home when you want, or your team has designated that maybe you're working in the office Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you're at home on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Now, post-COVID, or like where we're at right now, I wouldn't necessarily say we're post-COVID, but their thoughts are that whenever things go back to the way they're going to, that now 52% want this hybrid model. They have seen the light. They don't necessarily want to come back to the office. And so there is a shift in perspective here that employers are going to have to rationalize and recognize here. So what does this mean for you? You should know that some companies were already working remotely before the pandemic. You should know that some were already in a hybrid model, and that you should know that some teams or some companies were not in favor of remote work because maybe they didn't really quite understand it, or they didn't think that their employees would still produce at the level they were. They have now changed their minds. Okay. And then there's companies that are going to say, no, we need to do business in person here. So I want you to think about where do you think that you fit into this? And maybe it's not, you're like, maybe I don't need to work remote for my first job. Maybe that's something that I would like to have the flexibility of in the future. But I want you to think about this because when it comes time to offers, you're going to want to know what you're getting yourself into. And then you also want to consider, what is your own communication style? Like, how do you like to talk with people? Are you okay with, text and phone calls and Zoom? Or, do you prefer that? Work preferences. Some of us need the hustle and bustle to get things done. They're motivated by being around other people, whereas others realize, hey, I'm getting a lot done when I don't have everyone interrupting me all the time. So use the cues, and things that you've learned over the past year or so to think about, what type of work environment do you want to get into? And then obviously some jobs easily lend themselves to remote work where others do not. So, I want to take the engineering field here for an example. So, you might start out as a field engineer, and then as your career begins to grow, Maybe you're a project manager or something. So you start to get some of the flexibility just due to the nature of your job changing. So this is not something you have to decide now and forever. It's something that could evolve over time. But these are things to keep in mind while you are doing your search and beyond. So like I mentioned, you want to understand your personal preferences. You really do want to think about how you like to learn, how you like to talk with people, how you like to work. I already mentioned that the flexible work arrangement might be something that you don't get right away, but it might be earned over time. Or it could be something that with your job duties might change, travel and things like that. But if you're someone that says, I think I like this whole remote thing. I'm not too keen on, coming into the office, and, I wouldn't mind working for a company in Silicon Valley and staying in Pittsburgh. There are job search sites that already exist that are for remote work. So you can do a Google search on those, but FlexJobs is a big one. Remotework.io is another big one. And you really do want to make sure, though, for anyone, whether you want to be in the office or not, that before you accept your offer, that you know what the situation is going to be in maybe the next year or so. Because if you signed an offer with a company that was always remote, and you thought that they were remote just because of the pandemic, then you might be unhappy, always being remote. So I just want to make sure that especially with some of the tech firms, that some of the teams were already on this sort of hybrid model. So just know before you accept the offer. Okay. So another thing, though, in terms of the big trends that have happened with COVID, is that candidate recruitment has changed a lot, specifically with early career and college recruitment. So you obviously know, we didn't have our big in-person career fairs. We didn't have our big networking nights in person and things like that. There is some feedback, though, from employers, that it is possible that the recruiting environment has forever changed. And I just want you to be aware of this in terms of, what might be going on right now and the different types of employers' perspective. So when you take a look at traditional versus virtual recruitment, there were some things that were associated with traditional recruitment that was great. They had their target schools, they had their very select sort of process that they had laid out, years in advance. However, there were some limitations. They were missing really great candidates at other schools that maybe they weren't aware of or wasn't on their target list. It was difficult to reach them physically. They weren't going to pay to go into, another state if they didn't necessarily have a good return on investment. It was harder to take risks. Okay. They were also more reliant on these big career fairs and on-campus interviews. They felt like they needed to have a physical presence and meet people. Now, there was a tremendous amount of cost associated with in-person recruitment, flights and hotels, and there's a lot of travel arrangements, and there's time. It's, there's recruitment coordinators that's their main job, is just to coordinate all the travel. And so what ended up happening with COVID is they started to think, well, I'm saving a lot of money, not doing this. And in fact, I'm actually reaching more students because I'm hosting virtual events. It's not necessarily something that is interfering with their classes, or there's no time commitment the way that it was before. They might come into the info session and see it's not for them, or it really brought the focus more to the candidate versus the recruiter. So it also helps them recruit a diverse group of students. They're able to meet virtually with different student orgs that they might not have had access to on campus. So just so you're aware, there's going to be some companies that are going to say, hey, we might not come back to campus, but we're still heavily recruiting Pitt students, or, we still want to have Pitt as a target school, but we're going to do a virtual open house, or we're going to do a virtual info session, or we're going to email the student orgs directly. So just be aware that is sort of the mentality, because as you're interviewing right now, you will see that largely how they're acting right now is based on how successful they were this past year, and like what worked and what didn't work. So that's going to largely determine their future. But if you're graduating, all you're caring about right now is like, what does the recruitment cycle look like for me right now? Well, as I mentioned, some of the industries have been a little bit slower to recover. They might not necessarily have budgeted for certain things, or like they're not really sure what to tell you about remote work because they don't know yet. So I want you just to cut them some slack, and to ask them questions, get the information that you need. Don't feel like you're bothering them or anything, but just know that they're experiencing the same level of uncertainty as everyone else. Now, virtual interviewing is here to stay. Many companies were already using it. But the main difference before is that typically when you went on like a second or third round interview, companies were inviting you to their site, so you were able to see the physical location. And not all companies were flying people out and doing that, but, many of them were. But, obviously due to COVID, many of them are not doing that now either. So it is very important that you understand sort of like the work environment you're getting into, because it is very possible you're going to sign a job offer without ever physically stepping foot in that space and meeting those people, face to face. So some strategies for success here, starting with good first impressions, because they weren't able to come to campus and you weren't like physically running into a person and getting to know them. You need to make sure your online presence is top notch here. So obviously like your resume and your cover letter needs to look good. It also needs to reflect some industry specific things like, different keywords that you're seeing in job postings, and you're highlighting certain classes that, are aligned with things that they're doing, or certain skill sets are being demonstrated in projects or volunteer or whatever you're into. So that's like the bottom line, the resume and cover letter, those need to be, well represented of what you can do. But you also have to take into consideration that we are a handshake school. If an employer is on Handshake, they are probably checking out your Handshake profile. So just make sure it's up to date and it's consistent. And if you want to do something a little extra, put your photo on there too, so it looks like you updated it. And because sometimes they'll message you directly on there, and this could be after graduation too, as they're reaching out. And then for anyone that has a LinkedIn, which, is definitely another way to be reachable and to see what's out there, make sure it is consistent as well. Try to have all of these materials, be consistent, put your best foot forward. The Career Center is happy to help review any of these things and help with this whole process. Now, referrals into a company were always important, but they're even more important right now. Again, the personal relationships are key here. So I already mentioned conducting informational interviews. LinkedIn has got a great way to find Pitt alums. So you just search University of Pittsburgh in the search box. It will pull up this really nice other search engine where you could search for people with different job roles, company names, location, etc. So use that to your advantage. And then also the Handshake Employer Directory. I mentioned there's contact info that you could follow up on your applications. Try to stand out a little bit more. And really do a favor to yourself so that you know what the status of that application is, or you get a better idea of like what's happening with it. And then lastly too, virtual interviewing, you're all going to go through this if you haven't already. So check out Big Interview. The university has purchased this mock interviewing software for you. So you just go to pit.biginterview.com using your Pitt email, create a login. You can do recorded videos, interviews, as well as watch videos just on interviewing. I also want to make sure you're comfortable advocating with yourself or for yourself with pay and benefits and schedule. You want to know what you're getting yourself into. So like I said, really think about these things before you get into that process. So I know that was a lot of information, a lot of things to soak in here. I will be happy to take any questions. And obviously, if there's any follow-up that's needed to be done, you could reach out to me directly as well. But yeah, anything, with what I just said. All right. What do we have here? Oh, you're welcome. So I do also want to let you know that there are other events going on this week. And in terms of other things that might be of interest, there is tomorrow, there's a still searching now what, there's the deciding what's next. So like if you're really not sure what you want to do, that's a great workshop. There's also a series of Adulting 101 topics. So there's all sorts of things going on this week. I encourage you to participate in. And then before you guys go, if you could just do this very anonymous poll, that would be fantastic. I'm going to stop the recording now, but feel free.